Thank you for having me. Hi, I'm so happy that you've decided to come. It feels very strange to not hear myself, really. My name is Linn Friedrichs, and with a background in international education and learning and development, I usually talk about other topics. I talk about the future of education and work. I talk about diversity and inclusion. I talk about digital literacy, like last year. But today, I want to share a more personal part of my own learning journey as a palliative care volunteer. And I want to draw some lessons from my experience for education. So, welcome to my talk, Death Doula Superpowers, How Learning About Dying Can Actually Save Us. If the technology works. Okay. So because I'm an international educator and a learning and development consultant, I think everything we learn is ultimately about how we may live well in a complex world. But in recent years, I've started to wonder if death is part of life and an important part, should we not also learn how we can die well in a complex world? And so most of us, and myself included, live in a state of cognitive dissonance. We know death is inevitable, but we live as if our resources and the life that they make possible will last forever. So when we talk about education as the practice of learning how to live, we have an elephant in the room, a big one. Death. The biggest change maker, overwhelmingly present in our media, in our stories, yet unknowable until it happens. The one thing actually that happens to all of us, but it's one of the biggest social taboos, at least in many Western countries today. So, as a result, when death arrives, we very often don't know how to deal with it. We are unprepared logistically, we are overwhelmed by emotions, and we are disconnected from others. But in migration societies like ours, in international schools, in global universities where I've worked, and in an interconnected media world, death is actually growing a presence. So many of my students observe, like all of us, accelerating species extinction, drowning islands, people fleeing from their homes. Germany is actually the largest refugee hosting countries in the EU with over 3 million refugees, and 30% of them are kids and teenagers. So many of the students in our classrooms have fled from and encountered death. Many have lost their loved ones during the pandemic, and some have lost friends to suicide. So death for them also is all over social media. But even if we leave all of this out, students statistically come into contact with regular death, if I can call it that, before they turn 10, losing a pet or a family member, for example. So, So when we avoid death, it does not only leave us unprepared personally, it also keeps us from teaching vital skills in our educational institutions on diversity, on resilience, on sustainability, and on care. But how can we do better? I personally decided to become a palliative care volunteer and train as a death doula to change my own relationship with death. A death doula or a palliative care volunteer provides non-medical, holistic support for the dying person and a support structure or a community when and where that's needed. And as my relationship with death evolved through the training that I received, the educator in me actually started wondering, what can we gain if we develop a new relationship with death? Can we teach and learn how to die well? And what can we learn from those who care for the dying for a pedagogy of care? But first, why do we avoid death and why can we avoid death? And I just want to offer a few suggestions, and you might have your own because contexts are very different. And I speak only from mine. I think one reason is that we expect to live longer. Death does not happen as often because we live in a society here that has been peaceful for almost 80 years. And then progress in medicine and in living standards in public health have pushed life expectancy up from around 30 years, around 1900, to 81 years for a human born in privileged Germany in 2020. So we expect to live longer, and the way we age deceives us. We get new teeth, we get hip replacements, we get new organs, basically whatever spare part that we can imagine. And we even modify genes now. So I think that makes it very difficult for us to imagine that at some point we'll run out of modifications and we're going to die. Then we've professionalized and outsourced care for the sick and dying. We visit death in facilities rather than live with it at home. We also do not have a diverse and an inclusive and a positive culture around death, I think. The filmmaker Hans Block, who was here on Monday, said many of us struggle with transcendental homelessness. That really resonated with me. For example, if we're not part of a religious community, do we have the rituals available to us that help us grieve and that help us mourn and that help us heal? But ultimately, I think we avoid death because with it come questions that make us uncomfortable. They might even terrify us. Like, what happens to people who love or depend on us? What happens to our bodies after we die? What happens to us if there really is a life after death? So most of us stay away from death as far as possible. Not you, obviously. And as a result, we have not learned to care for those who are dying. We avoid thinking about our own death. We put off arrangements, and we struggle to address the topic with others. So what could we gain if we developed a new relationship with death in our lives and maybe in our schools? And here are my 7 superpowers. Superpower 1. If we had a different relationship to death, we would revisit what really matters. When we die, our priorities change. We zoom in on the little things. A carpenter who wants to cut and smell wood one last time. A nature lover who wants to feel the sun and the wind on their skin. My dad wanted a spoonful of fresh strawberries on yogurt that my mom had made. And we also zoom out on our legacy, the story of what our lives have meant. And sometimes we feel regret about all the things we didn't do, all the things that we did do. I think if we lived with death more intimately, we would be more present. We would be less susceptible to campaigns for purchasing us out of this feeling that we're never enough. And so we might curate our lives differently around what really matters. Superpower 2. If we had a different relationship with death, we would accept that we depend on each other. One exercise of my palliative care training really stuck with me. We had to role play first contact with our hospice resident. And I acted as the patient. I was lying in bed, I was pretending to be half awake, and I was really uncomfortable. I knew I was acting, but my whole body registered dependence. The bed restricted my movements, the choices available to me, and autonomy became very important suddenly. I was so grateful that the person who was role-playing with me moved slowly, respected my personal space, that they were patient and that they took the time to understand what I really needed. And I was reminded how vulnerable it feels to depend on others for things like washing myself, eating, and participating in social life. So if death and dying were in our lives more, we might be able to accept our vulnerability and connect more deeply with those around us. Superpower 3. I think we would act with greater compassion. Another exercise that became very personal for me was a role play about different perspectives and needs in a family system. Imagine a family member is released from palliative care and they want to die at home. And the other family members try to figure out, can we make this possible? Everyone sees this differently. One person fears that, as usual, they will carry all the responsibility and prefers full-time hospice care, actually. Another worries about working full-time and worrying about employment and the future for the family. And the other one maybe really wants the person home because they want to make up for time not spent. When we make important, difficult decisions, and we all know this, that requires that we take the perspectives of all who are affected by the decision. In this scenario, I took a role that was very different from what I experienced and from what I believed, and also from what I believed was right, actually. And it helped me understand what love and care can produce in terms of conflicts and explore perspectives and needs that were very different from my own, but equally important. Superpower 4. If we had a different relationship with death, we would know ourselves better. A big part of my training actually focuses on self-reflection and on supervision. If I want to care for someone who's dying, I need to clarify what I believe and what I need first. Otherwise, I project onto the other person and I might hurt them by making their experience about myself. For example, does the dying person who says that they feel lonely, do they want to reunite with family? Or is that a wish, an expectation that I have for them? Can I recognize the emotions that show up when I cannot bear someone suffering? Can I then set a healthy boundary? In learning how to care for the dying the way they need us to, I think we learn much about ourselves, our programming, and the communities that have shaped us. Superpower 5. I think we would be more creative and courageous. There is no standard operating procedure. There is no user manual for palliative care volunteers. And so people who support those who die must become very attentive and very creative. And I cannot tell you how much I admire chaplains and morticians and death doulas who create rituals, analog, virtual, that console and that give meaning to those who are dying and their loved ones. I admire hospice teams who fulfill last wishes that may seem impossible. Someone with an open tumor, a colostomy, or cramps can go to a Republica if a whole team works together. But what impresses me most about those who work in and who care for the dying, is that they actually have the difficult conversations that many of us, including many doctors, cannot hold. So if we could become more comfortable with being very uncomfortable, if we became more creative within the constraints that we find ourselves in, if we could talk about death with each other, imagine what else we could talk about and do. Superpower number 6. If we had a different relationship with death, we would prepare for ourselves and our loved ones. We all want our wishes respected when we get sick, right? And we want things to be in order when we die. If I want to increase the chances that I'm being treated in line with my wishes and my values as much as possible, I need to wrestle with some paperwork, like in advance directives. If I want to really die, not live on virtually, and force my loved ones to sort out my bank accounts, my social media profiles, and decide whether or not to keep my avatars while they grieve, then I need to get all my affairs in order, in the analog and in the virtual world. If I know my options and I make choices now, I protect myself and those I love. And it just feels really good. Superpower number 7. Being more familiar with death would help us discover new ways to advance social and environmental justice. The good, dignified death, as we currently define it, is not equally available to all. And it's also not sustainable. Dying is expensive. It starts at $2,000+ for an anonymous sea burial. It averages around $8,000, and it goes well beyond $13,000 in the German context. And then the preservative chemicals like formaldehyde that are pumped inside our bodies are hazardous. Modern caskets are made of metal, of wood, of rubber. All this goes into the ground or up in the air as emissions in the case of cremation. If we knew about and if we advocated for alternatives, like alkaline hydrolysis, which is the nerd term for water cremation, and I'm really excited about this, natural burials, composting procedures, if we knew about this and advocated for it, we could make a greener, more affordable, and inclusive death available to more people. So, can we teach and learn how to die better? I've looked at trainings for morticians, hospice volunteers, death doulas, at school initiatives, at university courses, and at YouTube. And my answer is yes, we can. In fact, we can start early, in primary school. 20 years ago, the Bundeshospizakademie, so the Federal Hospice Academy, began to develop a 5-day curriculum for 3rd and 4th graders and refined it through more than 1,000 project weeks. In the program, trained volunteers of the Hospiz macht Schule, so Hospice goes to school program, they used pantomime and gardening, Q&A sessions with morticians and doctors to explore these 5 key themes that I put on the slide. So they help students understand that change is natural and help them develop skills for dealing with it when it's overwhelming. They help them recognize the many forms of and expressions of suffering in themselves and in others. They explain what happens during death. They explore emotions of loss and ways of mourning in an age-appropriate way. And they empower students to support others who are sick and suffering within healthy boundaries and practice how to care for themselves when they suffer. I think that's an amazing program. But when death is so present for our students, as I have suggested, we do not only need a one-time course or one project week, even though these are really great and necessary. We need a pedagogy of care and a death-resilient culture. And I think we can learn important lessons for a pedagogy of care from those who support the dying. Palliative actually comes from the Latin root pallium, which means cloak or coat. So palliative care literally means putting a protective coat around a person who cannot be cured anymore. The coat must fit this unique person. So palliative care starts with what the human needs. And so does a true pedagogy of care. But the protective coat does not consist just of medication. When we die, we often experience what Cicely Saunders, on the slide, called total pain. Pain that affects all dimensions of our being and our life simultaneously. The pain can be very physical. It can be connected to a specific illness. It can be a result of side effects of a medication. It is often mental due to anxiety or loneliness. It is social, as a patient can worry about dependents and loved ones. And it is spiritual, when the dying person thinks and worries about what will happen during and after death. To address this total pain and to support the dying person, a caregiver must consider and address these 4 dimensions, the entire person, in the context of their entire experience. And a pedagogy of care brings the same holism into education. Students today need more from schools than subject knowledge and skills for the workplace. They need support for their health and their wellness. They need a community and a sense of belonging, a chance to discover meaning and purpose, and opportunities to make a contribution. So a real pedagogy of care helps the learner develop as a whole person. Now, many educators are overwhelmed because they wear too many hats. And they manage too many challenges all at once. AI, wars, social polarization, a mental health crisis. I think understanding that palliative care teams, or how they work, will convince everyone that a true pedagogy of care is collaborative. Multi-professional teams are the standard setup in hospice and in palliative care because we need whole person support as we learn to die. So from doctors to psychologists, to physical therapists, to death doulas, and many volunteers actually, each person has their own superpower. They know the boundary of what they can do. They hold each other accountable. And they are supremely collaborative. They are high-performing teams. Imagine what we could achieve if different subject experts, career counselors, representatives of spiritual life, social workers, psychologists, and other health professionals work together to reimagine and redesign teaching and learning. Imagine the education we would have. I suggest that students should know and be able to do the following when they graduate from school and when they take full responsibility for their hybrid lives. learning outcomes. I think they should be able to take perspectives, set healthy boundaries with their bodies and their emotions, and become very good at nonverbal communication. They should show and demonstrate advanced emotional literacy, something that we don't teach enough in schools, including an understanding of what happens when we grieve, when we mourn, and when we heal, so that they feel empowered to support others and to support themselves. They should understand what happens in their bodies when we die and after we die. I think it's essential that they can navigate the legal and the medical systems that shape how we can die today and understand the choices that they have. And I think they should be able to tell stories and create rituals, because this is how we make meaning. They should understand how care cultures have developed and which ones work for them. They should be able to refer others to professional and volunteer resources, and maybe they decide to volunteer themselves. They should organize their affairs in the context of their hybrid lives, including accounts, directives, profiles. And they should know different funerary practices, their origins, their cultural role, whether they are affordable, whether they are sustainable. And be aware of different, diverse cultural and spiritual approaches to dying and death care, because I think we can learn a lot from each other and other cultures. And finally, and I think this is really important, they should practice futures literacy and explore how humans might want to die in the future. So, learning about dying will lead us into social critique. We start questioning the status quo. I think that's great. I think we should inquire, and I think we should criticize, but we should also be curious and advocate for new solutions. And there are many inspiring people and organizations, and they do not fit on a slide. And I just want to mention a few, because they can open doors depending on your interest and where you stand with regard to the topic, that might be helpful for you. The morticians of the death positive movement around Caitlin Doughty and the Order of the Good Death in the US. Pioneers of Reerdung, a funerary practice in which our bodies are composted and can help address the soil crisis. There are alternative and innovative morticians in Germany, and I think we should seek them out. A huge inspiration for me is Alua Arthur's death doula training program, Going with Grace. And then there are filmmakers, one of which was here at Republica, who investigate what it means when we live on as avatars. And there are so many more. So I think Caitlin Doughty and the Order of the Good Death summarize it pretty well when they say, honest conversations about death and dying are the cornerstone of a healthy society. And I would add, a healthy society is one in which everyone can have, I quote, a meaningful, eco-friendly, and equitable end of life. So I want to close by inviting you to answer for yourself a question that death doula Alua Arthur asks those that she supports in their dying. What must you do so that you're at peace with yourself, so that you may live presently and die gracefully, holding both at the same time? Thank you.